Hello and welcome. This is G3 and you're listening to me on Literature with G3. In this video, we are going to discuss about Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown by Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf lived between the years 1882 and 1941. This particular essay was published on 30th October 1924 by Hogarth Press. This essay was actually previously published in July 1924 under the title Character in Fiction in the Criterion. Before jumping into the summary of this essay, we have to understand two eras. One is Edwardian era. The king who ruled in this period is Edward, that's why we call it as an Edwardian era. And also there were writers who wrote in this period, they are called as Edwardian writers. Just like that, the people who wrote after the year 1910 are called as Georgian writers, and the king who ruled in that period is King George. One of the Edwardian writers, Mr. Bennet, has accused Georgian writers. He said they are not writing realistically. According to him, their characters are not real, so their novels will be forgotten. So Virginia Woolf takes the responsibility of explaining about Georgian writers. She gives 2 points. One is what are characters and how do you call a character real. Second thing that she explains is why these Georgian writers fail to give realistic characters. With this idea in mind, she goes on to explain this in this particular essay. And we can also see that there are few writers who are categorized as Edwardians and few as Georgians. Edwardians are Mr. Wells, Bennet and Galsworthy. Georgians are Mr. Foster, Mr. Lawrence, Mrs. Strachey, Mr. Joyce and Mr. Eliot. In which she says we are all judges of characters. We all judge each person. We judge characters. We read their characters to understand them. The novelists, they go a bit more further to read these characters in order to write them in their novels. Now, the one thing that we all have to understand is characters keep changing. Each of us having a characteristics of our own age. Supposing if I lived in the year 1970, my character would have been different from what I am now. The example she gives is a Victorian cook and a Georgian cook. A person who cooks in the Victorian era would have had a different characteristics than the Georgian era cook. And she says there was a tremendous change happened in the year 1910. And one important thing that happened is people were moved towards modernism in that particular period. That is why she names the year 1910. And we also should remember that there was a change in the throne. Edward went off and we had George in the throne by the month of December in 1910. And she says these characters changes. The character changes can be seen in the works of Samuel Butler and Bernard Shaw. In order to explain about characters more, Virginia Woolf gives her own experience. She was traveling between the places Richmond and Waterloo one particular day. She traveled by train. She entered into the train. She saw there were two people inside the train. One was a woman in her 60s and a man in his 40s. The woman looked short and poor. The man looked like a businessman. They were talking, and once Virginia Woolf entered, they stopped talking. But the woman looks like she was happy that Virginia Woolf interrupted that conversation. They sat quietly for some time, but then the two people started talking various things. They started talking about, they talked about servants, they talked about oak trees and stuff like that. At one point of time, the woman dabs her cheek with a kerchief. That means she was crying and she wipes off the tears. And for convenience sake, Virginia Woolf names these two people. She names the man as Mr. Smith and calls the woman as Mrs. Brown. She keeps on noting what they are talking. Mr. Smith starts to talk about the conversation they previously had before Virginia Woolf could come inside the train. And Mrs. Brown says the thing will be Okay, since George, a person called George comes, this is their conversation. We do not get to know more on this conversation, but after which Mr. Smith gets bit irritated and he gets off the train in a place called Clapham Junction. Mrs. Brown also gets off the train a little bit later in a different station, and Virginia Woolf had never seen her in her life after that. So this is the simple person whom Virginia Woolf saw in the train. But Virginia Woolf could write 3-volume novel on this person, she says. She also notes various things about this Mrs. Brown. So she assumes a lot of different characteristics of Mrs. Brown. She assumes that Mrs. Brown and Mr. Smith already had a conversation in Mrs. Brown's house, and Mrs. Brown got irritated. She took her suitcase and came out of the house. She boarded in the train. She is an independent woman and stuff like that. And all these are Virginia Woolf's assumptions on that person. That is it. And Virginia Woolf goes on to explain that this particular character will be expressed differently by various writers. For example, if an English writer had seen this lady, he would have talked about her characteristics and personality. If a French writer had seen her, he would have talked about humankind in general with this Mrs. Brown. If a Russian writer had seen her, he would have asked soul provoking, tremendous questions out of this particular character, and this would even haunt the readers even after reading the book. This would be the case of various writers. She goes on to explain what it would have been if the writers, the Edwardian writers, had seen this Mrs. Brown. Woolf is giving us these examples to establish that Edwardians did not set a good example. Edwardians did not write well, so Georgians couldn't write well. They don't have a person to follow. That is why they are not able to write well. To prove this point, she goes on to explain how Mr. Wells would have written if he had seen Mrs. Brown. Mr. Wells wouldn't even have attempted to write about Mrs. Brown because she is poor. He would have seen outside the window and he would have written about some happiness like mountains, trees and flowers and stuff like that that are outside of the train, and he would have written that. And then she goes on to explain about Mr. Galsworthy. Galsworthy was also an Edwardian writer. He would have written about Dalton factory, the employers, the employees and stuff like that. He wouldn't even have written about Mrs. Brown because he doesn't concentrate on characters like that. And after explaining these two people, she goes on to explain about Mr. Bennet. If Mr. Bennet has seen Mrs. Brown, he was the only person who would have seen Mrs. Bennet, but he would have written smaller details like how she wore gloves, how the gloves looked, how the seat cushion looked, how the advertisement looked inside the train and stuff like that. After giving these examples, Virginia Woolf goes on to explain, goes on to read from one of the works of Mr. Bennet. She takes a work called Hilda Lesways. Now this Hilda Lesways, she reads out some passage. I'm just going to summarize that. So Hilda Lesways, this character sees from her window, she sees this person called Mr. Skellen coming to her house. When she sees him, she sees beyond this kiln and there is a flour mill, the smoke coming out of the house. She goes on to read paragraphs after paragraphs and about that area that is beyond Mr. Skellon. Okay, and also Hilda Lesway compares this particular Mr. Skellon to villas. So she goes on to explain about villas, and then this person also explains her own house. In his essay, instead of writing about a character, what he did was he started to write details about the place that person sees. Instead of writing about the character herself, the character keeps on explaining her circumstances, not even circumstances, the place where she lives. And saying all this, Virginia Woolf proves a point that Edwardians did not create a good example for Georgians, after which she goes on to explain what they lack. So, in order to explain this, she says, she gives us another example. Supposing a guest comes to our house. We do not know the guest, so we need to have a common point where we can start a conversation. For example, we can talk about the weather. That would be a great conversation starter. So we are the hostess, and we have a guest, and we start with the subject matter. Just like that, a writer will do to a reader. He finds a common subject matter to talk about to create interest. In our previous example, Mr. Bennet has taken buildings, villas as his common subject matter. He thought he could connect with the readers if he explains about the places. But that is just wrong, right? We should talk about characters, we should talk about their feelings in order to connect them with our readers. So Virginia Woolf calls this subject matter as tools. Since they have created a worst example, Georgians are struggling to create a new one. For example, she also gives another example. If people kept telling, if the writers keep telling the readers that women have tails and men have hump for a long time, people start believing it. And then when another set of writer come and tell you that only monkeys have tails and camels have hump, people will start rejecting them. This is common because they had a belief. If you say something that contradicts their belief, they are not going to listen to you. That's what is happening to Georgians. Georgians do not have an example. They have to create from the scratch, but they are struggling to create new things. In this struggle, they are failing, crashing, breaking. And to give an example, she talks about James Joyce's indecency and Eliot's obscurity and stuff like that. Virginia Woolf also says that even readers have their own responsibility and duties. And the responsibility is that the character who is real is part of us. We know this Mrs. Brown, some Mrs. Brown, and we should protest for their rights. If they are not represented in a novel correctly, we should reject that novel. We shouldn't be encouraging writers doing injustice to Mrs. Brown or any real character for that matter. And at the end of this essay, Virginia Woolf seems to be optimistic. She says she can see the signs of a brighter future. She says though people are struggling, though Georgians are struggling to write from the scratch, they will still make it. There will be a brighter and better future for English literature. With this thought, she concludes the essay. This was a very wonderful essay and I really enjoyed doing this summary. If you did like it also, please give this video a thumbs up, comment your views, share it with your friends, and please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening till the end.